Test 1, 2. Can you hear me?
Yep. Hey, Paul.
Yep.
Great. Rifat, are you sharing the slides, or should I do this?
I'll start with just the chair's slides first. I can share it from here, and I can probably hand it to you so you can drive it from your side, right?
Okay.
Let's just wait a few more minutes because just to give people more people a chance to join.
Yeah, of course. I just wanted to check in on the procedure.
Yep.
Oh, I think I'm set up now. Was kicked out for a second.
Awesome. Thanks, Hannes. Thanks for taking notes. Appreciate that. We'll start 12:05. So let's give people 2 more minutes. And get going. Okay, let's get going. Welcome everyone. This is the not well, as you know, probably already. This applies here, and it is important that you understand the not well and the implication of that. The not well governs everything that we do at IETF, so it's important that you understand this if you're not familiar with this already. Our schedule, we had 2 meetings, FedCM on OAuth 2.1. Today we'll talk about attestation-based client authentication. And a reminder that next week we do not have a meeting because it's Identity Diverse Week. Okay? So there's no meeting next week. We will pick up on June 4th with Pika. So that's our schedule. Any comments, questions about this? Okay, I may share Paul's slides here. And Paul, let me see if I can hand you the slide control. Can you should see kind of some pop up there, give you control over those slides. Do you see that?
I don't think so.
Oh, hold on. I think I passed it to somebody else. Let me see. How about now?
Yeah, it says Rifat passes the slides control to you, but I don't see a pop-up. No, that was the wrong one. Stop slides. Did I stop the slides now?
Yeah, but do you have control over, like, you should be able to share the slides. You don't have to share the screen. You can just use the, okay, let me see. Try again. Selection. Can you see the slides?
I can see the slides, yeah.
Can you control it? See if you can control it.
No, I don't see a pop-up. Do you just want to click through the slides? That's fine.
I can. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I've tried one more time.
I think now I can. Yeah, now I can see it. Okay, great.
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Okay. Then let's start this. So this interim call is about a draft adopted by the OAUTH working group. It's called attestation-based client authentication. And in the beginning, I will walk you through the status quo, what's it about, and what's the current status. And then afterwards, we will go into the main discussions around this draft and try to get some feedback. So as a refresher, what's the motivation for this? The main motivation is originating from the verifiable credential ecosystems that are arising and using OAuth mechanism, especially with the OpenID for BCI. The typical OAuth models that, for example, Torsten tried to apply to this when we started the discussions about 2 years ago, where that OAuth is mainly using authentication through a backend channel. But this causes quite a lot of privacy concerns in this model as the authentication provider. So in this regard, the wallet provider would see all attestations or all credentials that are being shared. And this is something that we wanted to avoid. And therefore, we acknowledge that it might be worth to see that the client backend may generate some authentication statements and pass these to the front end. And then the front end can give these attestations themselves to the issuer. And therefore, you have a kind of an authentication flow that runs through the front end. So the front end is communicating with a third party and not the back end. At the same time, we have a number of available platform and key attestations that are quite mature, and they can be used in, again, the issue holder verifier model, or like the verifiable credentials ecosystem. Environments that traditionally has been seen as public clients, so mainly native apps on Android or iOS, have these platform and key attestations, and this enables them then with this authentication flow to use these attestations towards the backend, and this then enables this authentication flow running through the front end. And this also is the motivation that we have a lot of different platform and key attestations that are often vendor specific, and the motivation was also to have a technologically neutral attestation that we can then use towards the authorization server, so that the authorization server does not need to understand all the different attestation formats, but we can have like a unified interface that is more stable, and that these platform attestations are usually not intended to be used for third parties. And so mixing this all together and also having some motivation that's mainly coming from IDAS. So I don't want to talk too much of this, but we have some use cases that need the issuance of high assurance credentials, mainly the PID, which is short for person identification data. It's kind of the national ID card credential equivalent. And we wanted to prove the authenticity of the wallet, and we wanted to prove authenticity and level of assurance of the keys that these credentials should be bound to. And there's also discussion that relying parties should be able to verify that the wallet instance is authentic. So these are all lots of use cases that would make use of this. So how does it look like? First of all, we differentiate between a client and a client instance. So a client is kind of the wallet solution as a whole, and the client instance, speaking in native app terms, is then one specific deployment, one installation of an app. And we want to enable that client instances can authenticate towards authorization servers. And therefore, the client instance generates a client instance key that's living on the client instance device. And it can then send this key together with some attestations to prove its authenticity to its client backend. The client backend can verify this information and generate a client attestation, sending then this client attestation back to the client instance, and the client attestation is signed by the client backend. And then if the client instance wants to authenticate towards the authorization server, it can make a proof of possession with its client instance key, and then send the client attestation and the client attestation proof of possession here in step 6 to the authorization server. So basically, it's a key-bound client attestation JSON Web Token. That is sent to the authorization server. Important to notice that this is the general model, but the draft only focuses on certain aspects of this on purpose, especially steps 2 and 4 are out of scope. So specifically how a client instance authenticates towards the client backend, which platform attestations or key attestations it's using is out of scope. It is more important that the client attestation JOT is defined by this draft. The client attestation proof of possession is defined by this draft. The communication, how this is being sent and generated, is defined by this draft. But these mechanisms in 2 and 4 are not. And also the trust mechanism, how the authorization server trusts the public keys from the client backend that are being used to sign the client attestation JOT, is also out of scope, so that people may use OpenID Federation or Trustless or whatever they want. We don't want to make any choices there yet, or do not intend so until now. Other points. So this is a slightly different architecture graphic. It just symbolizes that this key, for example, if we have this in a native app scenario, we have the app then probably living in a TPM, a secure element, a secure enclave. There's many technologies that can make use of this. This is one of the main intentions, to use hardware-bound keys or protected keys, because then the client backend can be sure that this client attestation jot can be used securely in the future. It is using in its current state the framework from RFC 7521. So it is a client authentication method. There's also some other benefit. It may be used in conjunction with DPOP to give better assurances about the DPOP key that's being used to secure the access token. So you could use this key or embed other information in the client attestation on the key that's being used for DPOP. It enables a direct authentication scheme between the client instance and the authorization server in a front-end pattern rather than a back-end pattern. And there were some discussions about how this could be used with DCR. So this can be used similarly to DCR, but may also work in conjunction with DCR. And that was one of the points that also led to one of the discussions later on, because DCR is a client authentication scheme. More on that later on.
Well, there is some discussion on the chat there. Peter, do you want to kind of go off mic and ask a question here?
Sure, let me try. So thanks for this, Paul. I guess first question was, the client backend, is that always sort of in the same execution environment? So it's always on a phone, or is it sort of, I guess, co-located with the client front end, or is there a network connection? And I just want to clarify. I think there's a comment from Oliver, but maybe you can just clarify that as well.
Yeah, so in the scenario that we mostly have in mind, the backend is a server that is being run by the client. So that's why we call it client backend. And the client instance is a native app that's being the front end. I think that is the usual pattern that most people have in mind that want to utilize this. But you can also put this in two directions. If you have a wallet, a browser wallet, basically both things are kind of a backend component. Or you could also run this, that if you have some very high secure key storage, this might also work as the client backend itself in this scenario. So it could also be both mobile, on the mobile app. But
Okay.
the main architecture that people have in mind is the client instance is a native app and the client backend is a server.
And what is it that the backend then attests to, right? Is it just, I'm curious what the basis of attestation is.
Yeah, so the ideas are that you want to attest the authenticity of the client instance, so that this client instance really is a front end or an instance of this client. You want to attest especially this key that is running or controlled by the client instance, because this enables the client instance to make the proof of possession and use and prove the legitimate ownership of this client attestation jot to the authorization server. because this public key of the client instance key is embedded in the client attestation JOT. So you're sending the client attestation JOT and the proof of possession with the key where the public key is embedded in the client attestation JOT. And therefore, the authorization server can check that the client instance is making a proof of possession for this client attestation JOT. Does that make it clear enough?
Yeah, that's helpful, Paul. And I'm curious, how do you think about authentication versus attestation in this case? Is that signature that's presented to the authorization center server, is that really an authentication event? I wonder if it's just a terminology thing, or is that really attestation that's happening?
Yeah, I think this will also be one of the it will be discussion number 2. So I may postpone the answer to this, and we'll get into this. I think it fits very well your question later on.
Okay, thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Yaron was in the queue. I don't see him anymore. So maybe Hannes?
Yeah, I wanted to phrase a few things that were mentioned in a slightly different way. The server side is essentially plays the role of it's a separate entity. So you probably, unless in very specific architectures, you want to have that as a separate entity because it needs to possess a couple of different information elements, which relates to Peter's questions about attestation versus authentication. In the attestation case, you want to also verify certain properties of the system. You want to know whether it's running the software you intend it to run, which means that that entity needs to have information about typically hashes of software, different layers of software from the bootloader all the way up to the operating system and so on. So that makes it different to authentication. So in that sense, it's not just a pure terminology thing where you do a find and replace of authentication with attestation. But there are, of course, similarities. And that brings me also to the key attestation, where the important thing is not just to demonstrate ownership of the private key corresponding to the public key, because that would be something that you get already with a regular certificate signing request. But the issue is that you need to demonstrate that the key, the private key, is stored in a specific compartment on the device and it cannot be exported. There is specific terminology that the PKCS series sort of established with this, like specifically PKCS 11. And there's some text about this in some other documents, IETF documents that one can reference.
So Hannes, just maybe a quick question. You talked about the boot process. Is that represented here in any form or shape in that attestation? At least my understanding, that's not the case, right?
It's represented here in step 2.
Exactly.
So
okay.
That would be abstracted away in this model. So the RATS architecture calls this the passport model. So this is kind of what Paul mentioned is outside the scope.
Okay.
And that's fine. Different attestation technologies exist that represent this stuff differently. So let's say Android uses a different attestation technology than, let's say, TPMs. And that's why.
Okay. Got it. Okay. Thanks, Hannes.
Okay, I'll continue from here. Let's see how a client attestation could look like. So it's a JSON Web Token. We have the issuer which is the client backend, or in other terms, in other scenarios, or let's say it like this. In most scenarios, the client backend is the issuer of the client attestation JOT, and the sub value is the client ID. There may be some scenarios where people buy or share an attestation service which is running this. So in some circumstances, the ISS and the sub value could be different, but in most scenarios that we imagine, the wallet provider, speaking in IDES terms, will be the one who's verifying its own client instances. We have some validity data, and most importantly, we have the CNF claim that contains the client instance key that is being attested to the client backend, and this key will then later be used for the proof of possession. If you want to add additional things that where the client backend can make statements about the authentication that the client instance did, and what security or properties it possesses, the client backend can add additional data. This is an example from the high assurance interop profile from OpenID that's using this, and that would make statements about the key that is being used as the client instance key. For example, this is a key from Strongbox, and it shows what user authentication is used with this key, and what level of assurance an authorization server or a credential issuer could achieve by using this key. But this is then domain specific, so that's why currently these values are then in a profile making use of this draft. This is how the communication would look like between the client instance and the authorization server. So the token, we intend to send this in the token request. Currently, we're using the RFC 7521 framework for client assertion. We have a client assertion type, and then the client assertion is 2 JOTs concatenated by a tilde character. The first JOT is the client attestation JOT that is provided by the client backend, and the second JOT is the client attestation proof of possession using the key that's in the client attestation JOT. And then the authorization server could read this, validate the client attestation, see that that he is trusting this client backend that issued this, and then he can check the proof of possession using the client instance key from the CNF claim in the client attestation. If there's no more discussions, questions to this, I would move to the discussion points that we currently have in the spec. Okay, then the first discussion point that we have has an open PR and has been extensively discussed also at the OAUTH security workshop in Rome, I think a month ago. And let's dive into this one. So we got a lot of feedback already at IETF 118 that this is an interesting mechanism, and it may be also usable for other endpoints, for example, the resource server or other things. And people may also want to use this with other client authentication mechanisms like DCR. This led to the discussion whether this should be a client assertion. We came up with a proposal to move this to a header-based syntax, so moving it from the body to the headers. The changes in the PR are very short. I linked the PR also in the slides. Is that we define two new headers, the OAuth client attestation header and the OAuth client attestation POP header. We remove the usage of the 7521 assertion framework for client authentication, giving the modified abstract of this. I think you can read yourself, but it's an extension to the OAuth protocol, which enables client instances to include an attestation and interactions with the authorization server or resource server. So we added that one also here. This new method enables client instances involved in a client deployment that is traditionally viewed as a public client to be able to prove an attestation in order to authenticate. Also, it was mentioned that, we should define the client instances because it's quite substantial to this. We've seen that this is client instance already defined in the what was it? Dynamic, was it in DCR defined? I think so. And we can have a look what this looks like. So this is what the token request will look like with the new proposal using headers. So the RFC framework is removed, and we have two new headers, getting rid of some squigglies also. And the first one is the client attestation JOT, and the second one is the client attestation POP JOT. The PR is almost done, I would say. So if you have feedback for this, I think you need to put it in the very next days. We're almost ready to merge this one, so looking for some last minute feedback here. Anyone has feedback on this?
Justin.
Yeah, so getting the attestation stuff out of the client authentication and out of the way of client authentication, I'm absolutely all for, which I've tried to bring up multiple times, and I'm really so if you're saying that this is the direction that we're looking to go to merge it, then I am very much in favor.
Great.
Anybody has a problem with this approach? Okay, I don't see.
We already had a long and lively discussion in Rome, so I think we have a lot of consensus on this one. Okay. So even if you just want to approve, feel free to do so to back this decision.
For those who weren't in Rome at the workshop, what was the contentious or the discussion point on this one?
I think we clear a lot of misconceptions about how this relates to DCR, and we got a lot of good feedback how this could be used in other endpoints other than the authorization server. That convinced some people that didn't believe it was necessary. And we went through all the arguments. I think the only argument that was not entirely resolved, or is that like the remaining one, and that's also added as a implementation consideration, is that if the OAuth client attestation contains a very long X5C chain, you may run into trouble with some web servers that have limitations on HTTP header sizes. But the consensus in the group was that this is good enough and the benefits outweigh this consideration. And we added this as implementation consideration.
Thanks.
Okay, then I would move to the second one. This is something that has been coming up, especially from Torsten, is a naming discussion. And this is also, Peter, why I wanted to postpone this discussion to this one. The word attestation seems to trigger a lot of people. For example, from the contents of RATs, especially for RATs, we like, due to the fact that we're coming from OAuth or the verifiable credential ecosystem, we use some different terminology that means kind of the opposite things sometimes if you compare it to RATs. So we were planning to put in some text how this relates to the RATs vocabulary. There's an issue for that kind of makes a mapping, and we intend to put this in the introduction. There were people also at IETF 119 that says attestation is something different and should not be used. In the context of IDAS, attestation is actually pretty much exactly what we're using. So again, it depends on the context. People have lots of different vocabulary for the same thing, and they use the same thing for different things, the same vocabulary for different things also. So it's a bike-shedding discussion, but it seems like a very important one to a number of people. So Torsten's proposal was to rename this and to remove the attestation word. And there's an open issue for better naming of this draft. Issue 71. Torsten's proposal was key-bound JOT client authentication. Maybe Peter, do you want to continue the discussion here, or bring up your point again?
Yes, I was actually typing, but I can save time and speak. I'll finish the typing as well. My perspective on this one is first just thinking about keys and key usage. An attestation key is a very different thing from an authentication key, right? And I think if the terminology leads us to be confused between those, that can create problems. So, as you described the diagram earlier on, that first step, right, where you go to that client backend, to me, that feels like that client backend has an attestation key, right? And it's making some sort of assertion based on the properties of the client instance that is interacting with it. But then the client, that key that's been presented and the attestation that's been provided, that key is then used in an authentication context, right? And I think just like this language that you have, like Torsten's proposal, I didn't read the issue, but the key-bound JOT client authentication, to me that seems far less confusing, and I immediately feel less anxious, right? Because when I see people using attestation keys and using them for things that isn't attestation, my concern is always that there's going to be abuse of that signature. So I'm in favor of like this kind of language much more, because it does give me it makes me feel like there's this, or it makes it clear that it's really a different purpose for which this key is used.
But would you agree that the client backend attests something to the client instance?
From what you've described, right, it sounds like the client instance is presenting some information, and the client backend then reasons over this in some way, signs some assertion. One of the things that gets signed or attested to is the key. I presume there is some kind of key providence. Maybe you're looking at some additional information about, this key is generated in hardware. It's a specific image, right? The software that's running, the application it's a specific image that's running, etc. And then based on that, there's some kind of assertion, right? Now, even that may not even be an attestation, right? That may just be what certificate authorities do, right? Effectively, not so much issuing even an assertion or an attestation, but really issuing a client cert type or a client, a token that the client can use to go and authenticate. So maybe the thing that it actually does is it issues a client authentication credential. Now that I think about that.
Yeah.
So, Peter, for the meeting minutes, I was trying to capture sort of whether you're in favor of what Thorsten is proposing, or you want to have something entirely different, or you're against it. That I couldn't quite figure out. Or you're not sure yet?
Well, the key-bound JWT client authentication, I actually want to check with Paul. That terminology, is the proposal that is used for the interaction between the client instance and the authorization server, or is that about the or is that the terminology that you want? If you want to use the terminology for that, I'd say yes. I think that proposal looks good, but I have to go read I haven't read issue 71. But I think in terms of so what does that apply to, I guess, is the question.
Not sure if I got it correctly. Like, our reasoning was that the client backend attests that a client instance is a valid client instance.
Right,
and it attests it in such a way that the client instance can show this attestation to a third-party EE, the authorization server.
And calling this a key-bound JWT client authentication, is that the terminology that you're considering for when the client instance presents this proof of possession that's associated with this key to the authorization server?
I think that key-bound JWT client authentication also is not a bad name either. And as you said, it depends from the viewpoint, because there's basically three parties involved. We have the client backend. In my opinion, the client backend attests the client instance. If you look at the communication between the client instance and the authorization server, it's definitely more about client authentication. So I think it's just a point of view, but like both are correct from my view.
Okay, but I'm still unsure, right? That terminology that you're proposing, for which interaction is that? Is that for all interactions, or is that only for interaction between the client instance and the authorization server?
You mean the terminology from Thorsten?
Mm.
Well, that's a proposal for the whole draft name. We're looking how to name, maybe that wasn't clear from the slide here.
Well, in that case, yeah, I would definitely say that's a better name for the draft as well.
Okay.
Hannes.
No, Peter just asked the question I was going to ask.
I see. Okay, I thought you have some comments. Okay. Anybody else has any thoughts on this?
Which issue number was that? Put it into the meeting minutes.
71.
Issue 71. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, then I would move to the third discussion point, which is the Depop integration. So many use cases where we intend to use this draft. Yeah.
Sorry. Like, if you can go back to that previous one, sorry, it's just to make sure, like, you got some feedback from Peter that he's in favor of this. Like, just wanted to make sure there is a decision here, or are we making a decision here, and is the work group comfortable with this, right? So, anybody has an objection to key-bound JOT client authentication as a name for the whole document right now, right? Swapping that name into this one.
I'm not having an opposition, but I would at least give Tobias the chance to express his opinions on this one also.
Okay. So maybe then
we can always change, we can always change our mind, but it's kind of a working proposal, and then we, not a big drama.
Right.
Yeah. But Rifat's question was: is anyone objecting?
Right.
Or can we get more feedback?
Yeah, more feedback is always welcome.
Yeah.
And people will see the meeting minutes anyway, and so on and so on. So there's a lot of chance to change.
Okay. And hopefully Tobias will see it and kind of chime in and on the mailing list, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Keep going, Paul.
Thanks. Okay. So discussion point 3 was on optional Depop integration. A lot of use cases where we expect to use this draft are for higher assurance use cases, and it is quite likely that you will use Depop in these cases because you make a lot of effort to prove that you are a legitimate a client, and you probably don't use bearer access tokens then. And most cases that this will be used, people right now are expecting to use Depop. And as I've said in the beginning, we also have a potential to improve the security of Depop because we can make some statements in the client attestation JOT about the key, the client instance key that's being used for the POP. And so you could use the same key to use this one for Depop, which would give better assurances actually for the Depop key. And therefore, if you want to do this right now, you would have 2 proof of possessions for the same key. And therefore, it was discussed if we could reuse the Depop proof of possession syntax for this draft. There's an issue 69 open for this, and what this would look like right here. So this is what the current status then probably looks like if you say, well, you're using Depop combined with this, basically having 2 proof of possessions, the Depop proof of possession here, and we have the client attestation JOT, and then we have the client attestation POP for this, and then both the orange part and the Depop part may be using the same key, and we have 2 proof of possessions, which might not be the nicest thing. So the discussion is that optionally, you could use, if you use this with Depop together, you could leave out the OAuth client attestation POP and only provide the dpop header, which also works quite nice because now both things are headers, and that would spare you of some complexity. That is a current proposal, which we will discuss once the header PR is merged. Any feedback on this?
Go ahead, Peter.
Okay. So Paul, I think I gave some of this feedback in Rome as well, and I'll repeat it here. It's really, I'm quite worried when we start using the same key for different purposes. On the one hand, you have this the JWT authentication key, right, that is used to do one thing. And now when you start reusing keys, you're turning this very valuable key into a signing oracle, right? Because with dpop, who knows what that nonce is? That comes back, right? Dpop's going to let you sign nonces, the authorization server. Hopefully you can trust it, but you're turning this thing into a signing oracle, and who knows what that signature could be misused for. So I would say, please don't do this. It's the sort of thing that we end up regretting later. And there's a long history, right, in the cryptographic world. When you start using keys for purposes that you shouldn't, it opens the doors for all sorts of attacks. So I really caution against it. I think the other observation is, given that you have this interaction with the key, with this, what do you call it, the client backend, why not just get a second key attested and use that for dpop, right? It would be great to have such a high assurance key available, but reusing keys in this way just feels like we're gonna, I sort of feel like I can write the security incident, right, 10 years from now. It starts with, if only we didn't use the same key. So that's my contribution. Please consider, I love that you're trying to optimize, but I think we're gonna regret that.
Thanks for this feedback.
Right.
Just to sort of put the other perspective on what Peter just said, that what's happening here though is using the same key for effectively the same purpose. The non-signing oracle mechanism is already going to be possible. First of all, it's a little suspect that that's a piece, because it goes inside of an assertion or a JWT that's signed with this key, and it's the server to whom this is addressed that's providing that data. And the same mechanisms are going to be fully possible through the nonce mechanism that's yet to be defined for this client, whatever we're going to call it now, this client key-bound, I'm sorry, JWT, I've lost track of the assertion. Whatever this is here, we already have the same thing. Yeah, and this key is used to create proofs that go to the AS, not the RS. But they're audienced as such.
I'm not entirely sure that I got your argument, Brian. Are you arguing that it is what Peter described is not a problem?
Yeah. Or that it's overstated. And that this is to, I guess, to Justin's point here, that this is an opportunity to optimize in the case when you're already presenting a JWT-based proof of possession to the authorization server, not to have to do it twice. And it's not a requirement. We've moved away from trying to make this the only way, because I don't know, largely due to concerns that have been expressed here, but the proposal here is to allow this as an optimization of both the payload and the signing activity and so forth in the case that you want to use these mechanisms together. The DPoP proof becomes, can be used in place of the OAuth client attestation proof, or whatever that will be called.
Yeah, so there might be some scenarios where maybe signing with this high security key is a little bit more pricey. So that could be one argument, that you maybe want to avoid this. Maybe you need to make a network call, or you need some expensive hardware key operations. Then sparing improved possession is not the worst. But yeah, at the same time, I see Peter's concerns. I'm not entirely sure if they are applicable.
Okay, we just a time check here. We have 2.5 minutes, so let's give people in the queue a chance to talk about this. But my feeling is probably we need to discuss it in Vancouver too. This topic, Hannes.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand Peter's concerns. I think if I summarize it here, and I think I get it, is like the key with the client attestation is used primarily with the AES, versus the DPoP key is used with the AES and the RS. And so if we combine the keys, then suddenly the attestation key would then be used with also with the RS, and that's obviously very different usage. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying, Peter?
Yeah, that's how I understand, and the risk that I see with that. And I mean, even with interactions with the AES, I would start getting worried. But the fact that you're now talking to the RS as well when you present these proofs, you're turning your attestation key into a signing oracle. To sign nonces coming from an RS, right, which could be structured anyway.
Okay. Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, Paul, maybe do you want to kind of wrap up here, because we have 1 minute here, and but I believe this is a good discussion for Vancouver, right? So
yeah. So just to maybe give the outlook in the last minute, because Brian touched it already. The last discussion point was about nonce fetching. In the draft currently, we advise to do replay protection or replay attack detection, either by using JTI or explicit nonces, and we recommend nonces. That was a long discussion in OpenID for VCI issues. But right now, we actually don't give a mechanism how to fetch a nonce. And this will be one of the next discussions as well.
Okay, awesome. Okay, thank you, Paul. Appreciate that. Let's continue that in Vancouver.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Bye.
And reminder, we don't have a meeting next week, okay? Bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.